about? Does a rising tide lift all boats and the distributional aspects of economic freedom? Okay, so here's what we know. For generations, researchers have been concerned about this gap that has existed in the incomes of Black and white. Look at that, 35,000 for Black, 59,000 for white. And this was back in 2016, and it's got even bigger now. Now, what does that mean? That means that when your income is lower, then obviously the accumulated wealth that you have is going to be lower also. And look how that translates. 6,400 basically for Black as opposed to 91,000 for white. That makes a big difference. If I have a smaller nest egg, then what is it that I'm going to be able to leave to my children, right? If I were to be able to go back, let me see if I can go back real quick. Uh-oh, going the wrong way. Try and go back one more time. So look at this difference, right? $6,400 isn't enough to get my children a nest egg so that they can go on to college. And so this problem exacerbates itself. And so here we are. We say that maybe economic freedom can help to close the gaps, right? We've got these gaps that exist in both both in income and wealth, and maybe we can use economic freedom. So what is economic freedom? Here's the definition. Individuals have economic freedom when a property they acquire without the use of force, fraud, or theft is protected from physical invasions by others. And B, they are free to use, exchange, or give away their property as long as their actions do not violate the identical rights of others. And that sounds pretty good, right? Maybe we could use this economic freedom concept to help close those gaps and have greater economic growth for the entire country. So what about that gap, right? What we know is that from 1947 through the 60s, the gap saw some convergence, meaning that those lines were closing. However, in the late 60s, we saw that the gaps started to diverge from each other. And we were even able to say, even though both absolute distributions have a tendency to converge to the respective steady states, they are diverging. So maybe we can, that's more on this gap, but maybe we can use this economic freedom. How about this argument? How about the argument that the gap exists because of racial discrimination? Well, Glenn Lowry argued that even with the total removal of racial discrimination, income disparities would remain without properly accounting for community and family and the acquisition of human capital. And so what do we mean by the acquisition of human capital here? We're basically talking about education, right? And so, or those skills that allow you to earn more. It could be on-the-job training, okay? More about the gap. We know that there is an intergenerational mobility gap that exists, right? Meaning that, let's say that you were born into poverty. The question isn't whether or not you were born into poverty. The question is, will you live the rest of your life in poverty? And what we see here is that Blacks were 26% less likely to move out of poverty. And here in the US, there's an interesting statistic going on. And that is that if you were born into poverty, there's a 90% chance that you'll die in poverty, right? So this idea of mobility isn't that great. So we got to come up with a way of fixing that. More on the gap. How about increasing education? Might not wholly do it. What if, meaning, what if you end up in a poor school system, right? Sure, you might have education, but the education might not be of sufficient quality. We also say that poor Blacks are less likely to have middle-class siblings than their poor whites, meaning that people at the bottom are more likely to have their relatives ask them for additional funds. And then those are funds that you can't use towards your own education, your own economic growth. Okay, I know I'm killing this stuff on the gap, but I think this is important to set it up, right, really well. Darity and some of his coworkers came up with this idea of stratification. And what is stratification? So it shows segments. And the stratification index captures the extent to which population subgroups occupy distinct levels on the income distribution. And this last point down here is the one I'll make that is most relevant, in that the median, and I hope you folks know what the median is, right? That's right in the middle, right? The median Black family would have a place that is the 32nd percentile of the white income distribution. And so that's not going to help close that gap. So let's talk a little bit about what the Economic Freedom Index says. It says three things. Let's look at the first one, the size of government, right? And so they come up with this index, and this is going to give us something to measure to see if it could be helpful. The government functions consist of government functions consistent with economic freedom are productive and protective. So, and that means that the size of the government should be small. According to them, they say that the size of the government should be small. The second one says that takings and discriminatory taxation should be limited. And finally, there should be one more, that the labor market. The labor market should be free of barriers. And that's what this third one says. The barrier to mobility of labor should be limited. And let's say all of that's true. And here's the index condensed. And so that's why I sort of hurried over that first part so that we could get here. Let's look at this, the size of government. Here are the things that go into this index that's going to go from 1 to 10. And if your state or government, national government, has a 10, then that means that you have a lot of economic freedom. And if your government has a 1, then that means that you don't have a lot of economic freedom. So, number one, what about the consumption expenditures of the government as a percentage of GDP? Meaning, is most of the spending in GDP coming from the government, or is it coming from private sector? What about transfers and subsidies? This would be stuff like welfare and other social programs, Social Security payments. Obviously, you know what that means. Let's look at number 2, takings and discriminatory taxation. What is the top revenue, tax revenue as a percentage of GDP, meaning how much are you being taxed? Top marginal income tax rate, how much indirect tax is taking place? How about sales taxes? And sales taxes are interesting because sales taxes are not often seen, right? We know that there are sales taxes happening, but they're not often seen. In the labor market, number 3, minimum wage legislation. Does your state have a lot? Does your state or government have a lot of minimum wage legislation? What about government employment? Now, some would argue that this is a good thing, but there's this concept in economics called crowding out, where we say when more people are working for the government, then they aren't working in private sector, and then there's this idea of union density. So let's take a look. And let's see how things have changed over time. And so you see that, remember, most free means that these states really were adhering to those principles that we just talked about. And then those states that weren't were over here. Here are the least free. Here in 1980, West Virginia, Maine, Mississippi, Maryland, and Rhode Island were the least free. But by 2010, the least free were West Virginia, New Mexico, Mississippi, Vermont, and Montana. Some of them were not very free and stayed that way. And then if you look at the most free, meaning they really bought into those concepts, you can see the difference between 1980 and 2010. Just thought I'd throw that in there to give you some perspective about the states. And so here's what the data looks like. We're going to have on the census years between 1980 and 2010, we didn't have the 2020 numbers, as you know. 2020 just happened and the census was delayed due to COVID. And so we don't have the 2020 numbers, but we do have 80, 90, 2000, and 2010. We have real median income. We have Black household income. We have white household income. We have that ratio. And this all comes from something called the Census Bureau's March Population Survey, or the CPS. And for those of you who are doing research, you might find this to be a valuable data source if you don't already use it. To that, excuse me, we're going to have total pre-tax money income from all adult members of the household, the percent of the households led by females, head of households, the average age of the head of the household, the percentage of the head of households that graduated from high school, that's going to be an education measure, and the percentage of households located in urban areas. Generally, what you'll find is urban areas, the incomes are higher, even though the cost of living are also higher. So here's all the data that we have, and here's what the numbers look like, right? And so these are my summary statistics or descriptive statistics. And I'll give you a chance to look these over to where, what's an interesting one to look at? So look, let's look at this. Black female head of household percentage. So in one census year, 25% of some state had Black female head of household, right? And that's what the mean was, where the lowest was a little bit over 2%, and the highest was 39%. So some state had as high as 39%, and some state had as low as a little bit over 2%. Interesting numbers, and I'll make these available to you if you want to take a look at those. Okay, let's take a look here and see what we got here. Here is income, right? So along here, we're going to measure economic freedom. And remember I told you it goes from that low of 1 up to that high of 10. And along here, we're going to have real Black household income. And as you can see, that thing seems to be upward sloping, right? I would say, you see that trend line going through there? I would say that that's upward sloping, meaning that as states became more economically free, real Black household income went up. Not very much, because if you look at that trend line, it looks like it's at about 5, and it's only going up to 5.5. So it's not really doing a whole lot. Let's do the same thing for whites, right? And that one looks more distinct. And if you look at that one looks to be going up, but the spread isn't that big either. And here's what happens when you just look at, let me go back here. Here's what happens when you just look at pictures. When you just look at pictures, you'd say, hey, economic freedom seems to be the thing to do, because look at there. As economic freedom's going up, real Black household income's going up. All right, problem solved. We're done. Just look at this picture, right? Let's look at the next one. Same thing seems to be occurring.
Sorry about that.
Oh, okay. Sorry. So it looks like that one's going up too. Now, let's look at the ratio. right? It looks like, however, the ratio is actually going down, or it's flat. And that's not good, right? Because it looks like that thing is sort of flat, even though if we look back, this one was going up, this one was going up. How in the world could that be the case? Well, it could be the case if you think about a fraction, right? If you have a numerator and a denominator, and the denominator is growing faster than the numerator, right? Then you're going to have that number actually decreasing. It could be the case that both numbers are falling, but one's falling faster. So that's why we actually have to do the analysis. And this part I'll just put out here for any of you folks who eventually become economists, that you'll do it. Here's our empirical approach. We use something called a panel data model. And don't worry about any of this stuff on here if you don't want to. But I just wanted to show you that there was some real economic analysis that happened here, right? And this is our approach here. So we set up this econometric model using a panel data setup. You know, pretty standard here. There's nothing fancy going on here. And as you folks end up taking any advanced statistics where they do something that they're going to call regression analysis, or you guys end up doing some econometric stuff, you'll see this again if you haven't already. Okay, so let's skip over that part because that's not very interesting. And here we are looking at it in levels. Black households in levels. And the one we're going to care about is right here, number 5. Look at column 5, right, which is the full model. The full model has both fixed effects and year effects. And if we look right here, that's the number we care about, economic freedom. It is statistically insignificant as it relates to Black household incomes and economic freedom. Despite what we just saw in the picture, when we do the model, we see that, economic freedom is not having a statistically significant impact on Black households' income. Let's do another one. Let's do white household incomes. Look at column 5 right here, right? The reason we want to do this one is you see this line right here that says fixed effects, yes. Year effects, yes. That's why we want to use column 5, because this is the one that has both effects and we're accounting for the model, right? So look, here you see, oh, wow, economic freedom had a positive and statistically significant impact on white household income. Oh, whoa, we got something happening here. But this was only looking at it at levels. Let's look at the ratio. Let's look at the ratio of Black to white. And let's go to column 5 again. And let's look at economic freedom, that line right here. And we see a negative number, not what we wanted to see. Because if we're talking about the ratio, right, what we're seeing here is the reason you're having that negative here is the denominator is growing faster than the numerator, not what we wanted. If we're trying to close a gap, we wanted this number to be positive, right? We didn't want that to be negative. Not good at all. Let's do this using logarithms, right? Let's do the same thing. We're going to use logarithms, and we're going to look at Blacks again, column 5, right here, this one, insignificant. Then we're going to look at whites, positive and significant right here, column 5 for freedom. And then we're going to look at the ratio using logarithms, negative and statistically significant, again, not good at all. Here is the same thing we just did before, right? Where we had blacks, whites, the ratio. This is for all states. But what we ended up doing was we wanted to be careful here because remember, some states in the US don't have a very large Black population. So what did we do with 4, 5, and 6? We excluded states with low Black populations. And the two columns we care about is column number 3 here, and we're going to look at freedom, negative number that is statistically significant, and column number 6 here. We're going to look at freedom, negatively significant, and even excluding. So we're on to something here. Here's the graph I really wanted to get to. Here's the graph I really wanted to get to, is right here. We wanted to know whether or not economic freedom was going to be good at closing the gap. And our answer, to my surprise, is no. Look here at the ratio. Look at here at this ratio of Black to white. And remember, the gap closes when you see a positive, because that means that the numerator is increasing faster than the denominator, right? Think about 2 lines, and 2 lines that are parallel with each other will never cross, right? So we don't want that, right? We don't want 2 lines that are parallel. What we want is, even if the top line is increasing, we want the bottom line to increase just a little bit faster so that they'll intersect with each other at one point, right? That's what we wanted. But what you can see here is, look at what's happening here, all of these negatives here. They're either 0, meaning no effect at all, or they're negative. And that's being borne out by the analysis we did. What's happening here, folks, is that the bottom line is going steady, while the top line, that would be the white line, is actually increasing. And that's what the data showed us. And that's troubling. Okay, now, someone who's sharp is looking at minimum wage legislation. And you're saying, hey, minimum wage legislation is positive for Black incomes. It's positive for white incomes. How is it that we end up with this negative sign here when they're both increasing? The problem is they're both increasing, but for whites, it's increasing faster. And that's how we end up with that still, even though they're both increasing, it's increasing at a faster rate for whites. And notice what's happening here. I want to be careful here. I want to point something out to folks. Look at all of these zeros. Look at all of these zeros here. You know what that means? That means that economic freedom had no impact on Blacks' incomes, not positive, not negative. It didn't do anything for them. So when you see all of these zeros here, so it's not helping, but it's not hurting. We need to make that distinction. And then we see all of these pluses here, right? When we see all of these pluses here, that means that our gap isn't going to close using economic freedom. And I got to tell you, as a researcher, that's why you do the research. Why do we do the research? Because had you asked me, was I going to expect to see these results? And especially given those pictures I showed you earlier, I would have said no. But that's why we have to enter research with an open mind and just see what the data tells us. Because here are the results. The results are all of these negatives when we should have had a bunch of positives. So let me give you some conclusions. Income gains from economic freedom are positive and significant for whites. Income gains from economic freedom are positive but insignificant for Blacks, the increase in income gap is a result of the 2 points I just told you above, right? And some work by Compton et al. Shows that the gains from economic freedom are positive and significant for the 2 highest income quintiles. That would be people at the top of the income distribution, but insignificant for the lowest income quintile. So since more Blacks occupy the lower income quintiles, then the positive benefits of economic freedom are not realized for this group.